Welcome to the Snoozy Scientist, a warm corner of the universe where science, curiosity, and calm carry you into a gentle sleep. Tonight, we're traveling back more than 400 million years to an Earth before green. The continents were bare, their surfaces scoured by wind, lifeless under a blazing red sun. No forests, no grass, not even the faintest patch of moss. A world of stone and silence. For hundreds of millions of years, life had remained in the oceans, bound to salt water as if afraid to leave. The land was a forbidden frontier, dry, hostile, and empty. But then everything changed. At first, it was almost invisible, small, fragile, and easily overlooked. But it was a transformation so profound that it will rewrite the entire history of our planet. This was the Silurian Period, a forgotten chapter in Earth's story, an age when life found the courage to leave the water, to risk the dryness of land, and to begin the long journey toward a future that would eventually give birth to the first soils, forests, animals, and eventually us. But haunting questions remain. How did a lifeless Earth first turn green? How did plants, fragile and delicate, learn to conquer and survive on dry land? And what strange monsters ruled the seas while continents lay empty? Tonight, we'll step softly into this quiet revolution and wander through alien seas to watch the first roots crack stone and to uncover how this overlooked age shaped the living world we know today. But before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from and what the time is there. It is always fascinating to think of these stories being heard across so many different skies. If you enjoy these gentle journeys into Earth's distant past, please do consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. A warm thank you as well to those of you who are already subscribed. You're helping this little corner of the internet grow. I hope this story soothes your mind and carries you gently toward rest. Now take a deep breath and let us step softly into the forgotten revolution that painted Earth green and made our world alive. More than 440 million years ago, Earth was shaken by one of the most devastating events in its long history. It was the end of the Ordovician period, and life had just endured a catastrophe that would erase most of the species living in the oceans. Nearly 9 out of every 10 marine creatures vanished. Entire lineages that had flourished for millions of years were brought to an abrupt end. The seas that had once teemed with trilobites, brachiopods, and countless other invertebrates were left strangely empty, as if the ocean had taken a long, hollow breath. This extinction did not arrive in a single stroke. It unfolded in waves, driven by a planet caught in a cycle of dramatic change. At first, the world slipped into an ice age. Vast glaciers spread across the southern supercontinent of Gondwana, which at the time lay over the South Pole. Ice crept outward, locking away enormous volumes of water, and sea levels fell sharply. Shallow seas drained, exposing coral reefs and coastal ecosystems to the air. Countless species that had relied on warm, stable waters found themselves stranded in a new world of cold and scarcity. As ice tightened its grip, temperatures fell, ocean currents shifted, and the chemistry of the water began to change. Marine habitats that had once supported thriving ecosystems became inhospitable. Creatures that had endured for tens of millions of years simply could not adapt quickly enough. Then, just as the planet reached its coldest point, the pendulum swung the other way. The ice began to melt, glaciers receded, and the sea returned, but not as it had been before. The melting released floods of fresh water into the oceans, disrupting salinity and oxygen levels. At the same time, volcanic activity sent greenhouse gases into the skies, and the planet tipped into sudden warmth. Shallow seas once again spread across the continents, but now the waters were unstable, warmer, and filled with chemical imbalances. Life that had managed to survive the cold was struck again by the heat. For many species, it was a second and final blow. In this way, the Ordovician extinction reshaped Earth. The oceans were no longer dominated by the same creatures, and ecosystems that had seemed eternal were gone. Yet mass extinctions are not only endings, they create openings. They clear the stage and leave behind vacant spaces for new life to enter. And that is where the Silurian story truly begins. When the extinction had run its course, the continents stood bare and almost lifeless. Imagine vast tracts of land exposed to the elements, nothing to break the monotony of rock and dust. Winds scoured the surfaces, carrying fine grains across empty plains. There were no roots to hold the soil in place, no greenery to soften the harsh lines of the landscape. The land was silent, but it was also waiting. This silence was not the silence of permanence, it was the pause after catastrophe, a breath between chapters. The oceans, though depleted, still held the seeds of recovery, and the continents, stripped and empty, offered new opportunities that had never existed before. For the first time in Earth's history, there was space for organisms to attempt something bold, to stretch beyond the water and onto land itself. The world at the dawn of the Silurian was therefore one of contrasts. The memory of devastation was fresh, but so too was the potential for renewal. The oceans that had been drained and refilled were ready to host new forms of life. The continents that had been barren for so long were ripe for their first experiment in greening, and the climate, though prone to swings, was settling into a warmer, more stable rhythm, one that would allow recovery to take root. From this emptied stage, the Silurian would emerge, carrying with it the fragile beginnings of forests, the rise of new predators in the seas, and the slow, steady transformation of Earth's surface. It was in this world of loss and opportunity that life would find its next path forward. The Silurian world was shaped by shifting continents. At this time, Earth's land masses were smaller than the vast continents we know today, scattered pieces drifting across an oceanic planet. Laurentia, which would one day form the core of North America, sat closer to the equator, bathed in warmth. To the east lay Baltica, the foundation of much of northern Europe, and Avalonia, a smaller fragment that would later become parts of the British Isles and eastern North America. During the Silurian, these three drifting blocks of land began to converge, their collisions raising mountain ranges in the process. Though these mountains were not yet towering like the later Himalayas, their slow uplift was a sign of the planet reshaping itself from within. As the continents inched together, much of their surfaces remained drowned under shallow seas. Vast stretches of the land were submerged beneath warm, sunlit waters that reached only a few tens of meters deep. These seas lapped across wide continental shelves, creating coastlines that were never fixed but constantly shifting as sea levels rose and fell. For life, these shallow waters were fertile ground. Sunlight poured through the clear seas, fueling photosynthetic organisms and allowing reefs to expand across the submerged platforms. The global climate of the Silurian was strikingly warm compared to the ice age that had ended not long before. With glaciers retreating, the planet settled into greenhouse conditions. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were higher than today, trapping heat and maintaining mild temperatures across much of the world. Polar ice was limited, and without the large sheets that dominate the modern poles, sea levels were correspondingly higher. The climate was not without its fluctuations, but overall, it offered a degree of stability. This warmth combined with shallow seas provided the stage for recovery after the great extinction that had scarred the planet at the end of the Ordovician. From above, the landscapes of the Silurian would have looked alien to us. Where we might expect forests and grassy plains, there were instead coastlines edged with reefs and long expanses of tidal flats. At low tide, these flats stretched out for kilometers, mud glistening in the sun, crisscrossed with channels and pools. At high tide, they vanished again beneath shallow waves. These environments were rich with life, although the life was mostly small and unfamiliar to modern eyes. Trilobites crawled across the sea floor. Early mollusks probed the mud. Graptolites drifted in the open water. Closer to the equator, reefs became the dominant feature. Coral and stromatoporoids, sponge-like reef builders, grew in elaborate structures. These reefs rose like underwater cliffs, their surfaces textured with ridges and chambers. Schools of small fish darted among the corals, while invertebrates attached themselves to every available surface. These reef systems were unlike anything the planet had seen before, larger and more intricate than their Ordovician predecessors. For the organisms that survived the Great Extinction, reefs provided both shelter and opportunity. In other regions, the meeting of land and sea formed broad mudflats. These were unstable places, shaped daily by tides and storms. Sediments were constantly being moved, layered, and reshaped, creating a shifting mosaic of habitats. In the mud, burrowing animals left behind networks of tunnels and tracks. These traces, preserved in the rock record, show how active even the shallowest and most temporary environments could be. Mudflats also played an important role in the slow preparation of land for plants. Though still barren to the eye, their constant cycles of wetting and drying created conditions that would eventually allow life to gain a foothold on shore. The Silurian earthscape was therefore a world of water-dominated features. Continents were smaller, seas were higher, and coastlines were complex and ever-changing. The merging of Laurentia, Baltica, and Avalonia hinted at future geological dramas, while the reefs, tidal flats, and mudflats shaped the environments where life was beginning to recover and experiment. It was a world of warm stability, after a time of extremes, a pause that gave living things the chance to adapt and explore new possibilities. In the quiet warmth of the Silurian world, something new began to appear along the edges of shallow waters. Among the mudflats and tidal plains, fragile green shoots stood upright, thin and leafless, yet defiant against the empty landscape around them. These were the earliest vascular plants, pioneers that would change Earth more completely than any creature of the sea or land. Unlike the simple algae that had long floated in water or clung to damp rock, these plants carried inside them a new invention: vascular tissue. Tiny tubes running through their stems allowed water and nutrients to be pulled upward from the ground. This gave them strength to rise above the surface, lifting themselves higher than the mats of algae that lay flat against stone. Though they stood only a few centimeters tall, their height was a revolution. For the first time, plants could compete for sunlight in a new way, and in that competition, the story of forests was seeded. One of the earliest of these plants is known as Cooksonia. Its fossils are delicate, branching stems that split into simple forked patterns, ending in round sporangia that carried spores. To us, they may look almost too simple to matter, a bare twig compared to the mighty trees that would come later. Yet Cooksonia was a signal that Earth was beginning to change. Its upright posture, supported by vascular tissue, allowed it to colonize land more effectively than any organism before it. Its spores could be carried by wind, scattering across barren ground and settling in new places. With each generation, these tiny plants spread further from the shore, stepping slowly into territory that had been untouched for hundreds of millions of years. Beneath the surface, their roots and anchoring structures began to pry apart the rock. At first, these were not deep or complex root systems, but even the smallest penetration of stone allowed water to seep in and begin breaking down minerals. Over time, this process created the first true soils. Once the rock crumbled, It held moisture differently, forming layers where nutrients could collect. These early soils were thin and patchy, but they were the foundation on which all terrestrial ecosystems would one day stand. Without them, no forests could rise, no animals could graze, and no land based food chains could develop. This transformation might seem quiet, even slow, but its importance cannot be overstated. By creating soil, plants rewrote the chemistry of the land. The minerals released from rock fed not only the plants themselves, but also the microorganisms that thrived around them. Water cycles began to change as soils absorbed and released rainfall in ways that bare rock never could. As these tiny plants grew and spread, they began to draw more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, releasing oxygen into the air. What had started as a thin scattering of stems would eventually shift the balance of gases on a planetary scale. The world before these vascular plants had been a harsh one. Winds swept across lifeless rock, carrying dust across continents. With no roots to hold sediments in place, erosion was constant. Rainwater washed quickly off stone, rushing back into the sea. But with the rise of these first plants, landscapes began to soften. Roots held sediments together, preventing them from being swept away. Fragile mats of greenery trapped dust, anchoring it in place and allowing more soil to form. Bit by bit, barren land was tamed. It is difficult to imagine the courage of such small plants pushing into an empty world with no guarantee of survival. They had no leaves, no flowers, no seeds. They were little more than branching stems tipped with spore capsules. Yet in their simplicity lay their strength. By standing upright, they could capture sunlight more effectively. By producing spores, they could spread far beyond the reach of their parent. By breaking down rock, they opened new ground for future generations. This step, humble as it seemed, was Earth's greatest transformation. From it would grow forests that cooled the planet, oxygen rich skies that fueled animal life, and ecosystems that would one day cradle human civilization. The first vascular plants did not know what future they were shaping, yet with every fragile stem and every root pressing into stone, they were building a world that was finally ready to support life on land. The story of Cooksonia and its kin is not one of grandeur, but of persistence. Against winds, against floods, against the indifference of barren continents, they endured. And with each season, they left behind a slightly different earth, one with a little more soil, a little more oxygen, and a little more promise of what was to come. From these beginnings, the conquest of land had truly begun, setting the stage for the next spread of greenery that would alter the atmosphere and extend life's reach even further. As the first vascular plants like Cooksonia stood in the shallows, the greening of Earth began to spread in ways both fragile and transformative. Small, delicate plants resembling modern mosses and liverworts crept outward from the wet margins of tidal flats and mud rich coastlines. They had no roots in the sense we know today, only anchoring threads that clung to the ground, but they were able to hold themselves against stone and soil just enough to survive. These low mats of greenery softened the edge of the continents, tracing the outlines of rivers and streams like the first strokes of a painter's brush across a barren canvas. The spread of these early plants depended on a new strategy for reproduction. Unlike animals, they did not move from place to place in search of mates. Instead, they relied on spores, microscopic capsules carried by the wind. Each spore contained the potential for a new plant, and when scattered widely, they landed in cracks, hollows, and damp soil where they could begin again. Spores could travel far from the parent plant, giving these pioneers a way to reach new ground without needing to crawl or walk. In a world without insects or birds to carry seeds, spores were their wings. This reliance on spores meant that early plants were closely tied to water, They needed moisture for the spores to germinate and for the fertilization process to succeed. So at first, they hugged the damp edges of shorelines and the misty zones around lakes and rivers. But over time, some began to adapt more fully to the challenges of land, creating tougher spores with thicker walls, better able to withstand drying out. With each small improvement, the distance they could spread inland grew greater. As these mats of moss like plants expanded, something remarkable began to happen to the air itself. Through photosynthesis, they absorbed carbon dioxide and released oxygen. In the oceans, algae had been doing this for hundreds of millions of years, but the impact of photosynthesis on land was different. Instead of releasing oxygen into water, where it dissolved or reacted with minerals, it went directly into the atmosphere. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the composition of the air began to shift. Oxygen levels crept upward. With every season of growth, the atmosphere became just a little more supportive of future animals that would one day breathe it. The landscapes themselves began to change. Where once rainwater had rushed quickly across bare rock, it now lingered longer in the tangled mats of greenery. Soils grew darker with organic matter, rich with decayed plant material that had never existed before. The ground held moisture differently, becoming spongier in places, more stable in others. Instead of silence broken only by wind, the continents began to acquire texture, both visually and chemically. It is a quiet picture, yet an extraordinary one. Imagine the edges of a continent after a summer rain, where the barren ground is stippled with small green clusters, spreading outwards like colonies of hope. These plants were not tall, nor were they complex, yet they softened a harsh and empty world. From their tiny bodies came spores that drifted into new territory. From their fragile cells came oxygen that filled the air, and from their silent presence came the first landscapes that looked, in some faint way, alive. The conquest of land was not a single dramatic leap, but a patient and persistent spread. The first plants clung where they could, testing the ground, leaving behind pockets of soil, and preparing the land for others that would follow. In this way, they transformed the continents, not through sudden domination, but through countless tiny steps. Their mats of green spread outward, patch by patch, until the once barren world began to show the first hints of a future covered in forests. The greening of Earth had truly begun, and with it the atmosphere itself was changing. The balance of gases that had once belonged entirely to oceans was now being rewritten above the continents, and as the air shifted, the stage was being set for the creatures of the sea to eventually follow plants onto land, taking their first tentative steps into this newly softened world. While plants were beginning their quiet spread across the continents, life beneath the waves was stirring back to strength. The oceans, which had been emptied by the devastation of the Ordovician extinction, were slowly recovering. What had once been hollow silence began to fill again with movement, color, and form. In this return of abundance, one of the most striking features of the Silurian seas rose into prominence: the Coral-stromatoporoid reefs. These reefs were unlike anything seen before. Coral had existed earlier, but now it began to grow in concert with stromatoporoids, sponge-like organisms that could build layered skeletons of calcium carbonate. Together, they created vast structures that spread across shallow seas. They were not small outcrops or scattered patches, but immense underwater ridges and platforms that could stretch for kilometers. In places, they formed walls that rose like cities beneath the sunlit waters, their surfaces textured with chambers, ridges, and hollows. The architecture of these reefs was as varied as any skyline. Crevices provided shelter for small creatures, surfaces offered space for attachment, and inner chambers created refuges where water flowed more gently. Fish swam through their corridors, weaving between coral towers and sponge domes. Invertebrates clung to every surface. Crinoids extended delicate arms to catch drifting food. Brachiopods anchored themselves in clusters, and mollusks grazed across surfaces where algae found purchase. For the survivors of the Great Extinction, these reefs were havens. They were nurseries where young fish could hide, feeding grounds where invertebrates thrived, and protective barriers against the force of tides and waves. Each reef was a living city, sustained by the constant cycling of nutrients. Organisms that had once struggled to find stable habitats in the aftermath of disaster now found themselves with endless possibilities. The growth of reefs also transformed the chemistry of the seas. As corals and stromatoporoids built their skeletons, they locked away carbon in solid form, creating balance in the carbon cycle. This, in turn, affected the broader climate, helping the planet maintain the relative warmth and stability that defined the Silurian. In their silent growth, reefs were not only shaping ecosystems, but also moderating the world itself. Marine diversity began to recover in waves. Fish, which had been modest and limited in earlier times, now darted more confidently through the waters, their numbers increasing as they adapted to the shelter of reefs. Trilobites, though declining in dominance, still scuttled across the seafloor, joining new arthropod species in scavenging and feeding. Graptolites floated in the open seas, drifting colonies that filtered nutrients from the water. All of these creatures found space in the mosaic of environments created by reef complexes. The importance of these reefs cannot be overstated. They acted as anchors for ecosystems that might otherwise have remained fragile. Without reefs, many organisms would have lacked places to settle or breed. With them, life not only returned but diversified. Species that had survived the Ordovician collapse could now expand into new niches, experimenting with new forms, new diets, and new interactions. From a distance, the reef platforms would have seemed like vast undersea continents of life. Sunlight, pouring through clear water, illuminated their surfaces, casting shadows across ridges and channels. Schools of early fish shimmered in the glow, while armored predators patrolled the edges. The hum of activity, though silent to us, was the heartbeat of renewal. These were ecosystems learning to thrive again, delicate yet resilient, fragile yet expansive. The reefs also marked a turning point in Earth's story. They represented not just survival, but stability. After the chaos of ice ages and sudden warming, after the loss of nearly all marine life, the planet had found balance. Coral-stromatoporoid reefs stood as monuments to that balance, reminders that even after collapse, life has the power to rebuild and to rise higher than before. And as these reefs expanded, the oceans became landscapes of possibility once more, ready to host the next great players in Earth's unfolding drama, including the armored hunters and the giants of the shallow seas that would soon dominate these waters. As reefs expanded and life returned to the oceans, new predators began to rise in the shallows. Among the most formidable were the Eurypterids, often called sea scorpions. These creatures were not insects or true scorpions, but ancient relatives of arachnids. Their bodies were long and segmented, armored with tough exoskeletons that glinted under the sunlight filtering through the water. Some species were modest in size, no larger than a hand, but others grew into giants, stretching to lengths of 2.5 meters, longer than the height of a grown human. In the warm, shallow seas of the Silurian, these predators were masters of their realm. With broad, paddle-like appendages, they glided with surprising speed and grace. Their swimming strokes pushed them through the water in smooth, powerful motions, allowing them to close the distance to prey before it could escape. When they reached their target, claws lined with sharp spines seized hold, locking struggling fish or invertebrates in an unbreakable grip. The adaptations of Eurypterids gave them an advantage that few other creatures of the Silurian could match. Their armored plates offered protection from rivals and from the bites of the first jawed fish that were beginning to test the waters. Their compound eyes, perched high on their heads, scanned their surroundings with precision, detecting the faintest ripple of movement. Some had elongated tails tipped with spines, which may have been used as weapons in combat or as tools for steering through the water. Every part of their anatomy reflected the role of a predator perfected by evolution. Imagine standing in shallow water at the edge of a Silurian reef, the surface bright with sunlight. Suddenly, a shadow slides beneath you, silent and swift. The dark form resolves into the shape of a sea scorpion, its paddles undulating, claws open and ready. It would have inspired both fear and awe, for its size and power were unlike anything else that shared its environment. Even modern oceans, filled with sharks and whales, rarely hold predators of such striking form. These giants did not live in isolation. They shared the waters with smaller Eurypterid species that scuttled along the seafloor, searching for worms or scavenging from carcasses. The diversity of Eurypterids was immense, with dozens of forms adapted to different habitats. Some preferred deeper waters, others dominated estuaries or tidal flats, where they lurked in murky shallows, waiting for prey to pass by. Together, they created a dynasty of predators that endured for millions of years, shaping the food webs of their time. The dominance of Eurypterids was not only a matter of size, it was also their strategy. They were opportunistic hunters, capable of ambushing or chasing, attacking creatures that ranged from fish to other arthropods. Fossil evidence suggests that some may even have ventured close to shorelines, where their armored bodies allowed them to crawl in the shallows for short periods. Whether in open water or near the edges of land, they were a presence that smaller creatures could never ignore. To imagine encountering one of these sea scorpions today is to imagine an encounter with strangeness itself. A 2-meter predator with the armored body of a scorpion and the paddles of a swimmer would seem like something out of nightmare. Yet in the Silurian seas, they were not monsters but simply rulers of their environment, filling the role that evolution had prepared for them. Their reign in the shallows left an imprint on ecosystems, shaping the behaviors of prey and influencing the rise of competitors like the jawed fish that were beginning to emerge. In this age of sea scorpions, the shallow waters were places of both richness and danger. Reefs provided shelter, but they were also hunting grounds. Mudflats offered nutrients, but they also held lurking shadows. The Eurypterids were both a symbol of recovery after catastrophe and a reminder of nature's capacity to create predators of extraordinary form. They were part of a larger story of oceans that were regaining life, only to hand the stage, in time, to new rivals that would challenge even the scorpions of the sea. In the Silurian seas, alongside the shadows of sea scorpions, another story was unfolding. Small at first, almost unnoticeable, it would soon grow into one of the most important steps in the history of life. For hundreds of millions of years, fish had existed as jawless creatures. They fed by filtering water through gill-like openings or by scraping at surfaces with toothless mouths. Their bodies were armored with bony plates or scales, but they were limited in how they could interact with the world. They could feed only in simple ways, unable to bite, unable to seize. That changed with the appearance of the first placoderms. Placoderms were armored fish whose heads and upper bodies were covered in thick, interlocking plates. These plates gave them a formidable appearance, but what set them apart was not only their armor. For the first time in Earth's history, vertebrates had jaws. Two arches of bone had shifted and evolved into structures capable of opening and closing with force. With this invention, a whole new dimension of feeding became possible. Instead of scraping or filtering, placoderms could bite. They could grasp prey, crush shells, and tear food apart in ways no fish had ever done before. The arrival of jaws was one of the great turning points in evolution. It was more than just a new tool, it was a doorway into new possibilities for survival. A fish with jaws could pursue larger prey. It could compete more effectively. It could shape its environment by becoming a predator in the true sense of the word. With jaws, fish also developed stronger muscles in their heads and throats, making their bites more powerful. This strength gave them access to resources that jawless creatures could never exploit. The placoderms were not the only pioneers of this transformation. Around the same time, another lineage was beginning to appear, one that would one day dominate the oceans. These were the cartilaginous fish, ancestors of modern sharks and rays. Unlike the heavily armored placoderms, their skeletons were made of cartilage, light and flexible, which gave them speed. While placoderms moved through the water with the weight of bone plates slowing them down, these early cartilaginous fish cut through the seas with agility. Though still primitive compared to their descendants, they hinted at the predators that would one day take over from sea scorpions and even placoderms themselves. The rise of jawed fish changed the balance of life in the seas. Predators became more diverse, and prey had to adapt in turn. Fish developed new defenses, from heavier scales to faster swimming patterns. Invertebrates evolved thicker shells and more complex ways of hiding. For the first time, ecosystems began to show the back and forth rhythm of predator and prey, locked in a cycle of adaptation that would continue to shape evolution through all the ages that followed. The sight of a Silurian reef would have been a vision of this new balance. Among the corals and stromatoporoid sponges, schools of smaller jawless fish still swam, but now they had to navigate carefully, for armored placoderms lurked nearby, their jaws ready to snap shut on the unwary. The first shark-like fish, with leaner bodies and sharper senses, patrolled more open waters, moving with an energy that promised the future of fast pursuit. Sea scorpions still dominated the shallows, but their rule was no longer unchallenged. For the first time, vertebrates were beginning to rival arthropods as the most effective hunters of the seas. This interplay of hunters and hunted gave the Silurian oceans a new rhythm. It was no longer only a world of survival through endurance or numbers. It had become a world where power and precision mattered. Jaws meant that a predator could kill more quickly and more efficiently. Prey, in turn, had to find new ways to survive, whether through speed, armor, or cunning. The oceans became theaters of strategy as much as strength, with each innovation met by a counter-innovation. From these beginnings, the story of vertebrate dominance in the seas was set in motion. The armored placoderms would eventually fade into extinction, but the lineage of jawed fish they represented would continue. The cartilaginous ancestors of sharks would evolve into some of the most efficient predators the world has ever known. And from the foundation laid in the Silurian, new forms of fish would arise in the Devonian, an age that would be remembered as the true age of fishes. For now, though, the Silurian oceans were alive with firsts. The first jaws snapping shut, the first armored hunters shaping ecosystems through their bites, the first hints of sharks beginning to emerge. In this new world of predator and prey, Balance itself was being rewritten, and with it, the path that would lead eventually to every vertebrate that walks, swims, or flies today. For more than 200 million years, trilobites had been among the most successful creatures in the ocean. They first appeared long before the Silurian, during the Cambrian, and quickly diversified into hundreds of forms. Their segmented bodies, hard exoskeletons, and ability to adapt to many habitats made them resilient survivors. Some lived as bottom dwellers, shuffling slowly through the sand. Others burrowed, scavenged, or even swam freely in the water column. For a time, it seemed as though trilobites would remain an eternal presence in the seas. By the Silurian, however, their reign was fading. Trilobites were still there, crawling across reef floors and mudflats, but they were no longer the dominant force they had once been. Their diversity was shrinking. The fossil record shows fewer species compared to earlier periods, and the variety of shapes and lifestyles that had once made them so successful was beginning to contract. Where once they had filled nearly every niche in the marine world, now other arthropods were beginning to claim those roles. One reason for their decline was competition. The oceans of the Silurian were becoming more complex, with predators and prey locked in an escalating struggle. Eurypterids, the great sea scorpions, roamed the shallows with powerful claws and paddle-like limbs, hunting with speed and efficiency. Smaller crustacean relatives were also beginning to appear, more agile and adaptable in certain habitats. These new arthropods could exploit food sources more effectively, often outcompeting trilobites in environments where both tried to survive. Predation was another pressure. Trilobites had long relied on their hard exoskeletons as protection. Some could even curl into tight balls, exposing only their armored backs to danger. This defense worked well against earlier predators, but with the arrival of jawed fish, the calculus of survival shifted. Jaws could crush shells, turning what had once been a reliable shield into little more than brittle armor. Placoderms, with their bony biting plates, could crack through trilobite shells with ease. What had protected them for millions of years was no longer enough. Fossils give us glimpses of this story. In certain rocks, trilobite shells bear scars and bite marks, evidence of encounters with predators that left them damaged or dead. Other fossils show how their once vast numbers had dwindled. In Cambrian layers, trilobite fossils can dominate entire slabs of stone pressed together in clusters that suggest thriving populations. By the Silurian, those dense fields of fossils had given way to scattered individuals. They were still present, still part of the fabric of marine life, but their abundance was no longer the same. The decline of trilobites was not immediate or total. Many groups continued to survive through the Silurian and into later periods. Some even managed to diversify again, finding temporary success in specific environments. But the long arc of their history was bending downward. Each extinction event, each new competitor, each new predator chipped away at their resilience. The Silurian marks the point at which they began to slip from dominance into the shadows of other creatures rising around them. The sight of a Silurian reef would have told the story clearly. Trilobites could still be found, their many-legged bodies moving across the seafloor, antennae twitching as they searched for food. Some rested in burrows, their compound eyes peeking out from beneath a layer of sediment. Others crept among corals, scavenging from the remains of meals left behind by larger predators. But they were no longer the rulers of these environments. Around them swam jawed fish, swift and powerful. Above them hunted eurypterids, their claws ready to seize. Even the smaller arthropods, nimble and quick, pressed in around them. The fossil record preserves the silence of their shrinking presence. Where once trilobites had been countless, their shells forming layers of stone across entire continents, their remains in the Silurian speak more softly. They were still there, but no longer filling the oceans with the same energy and diversity. The stage was shifting, and trilobites were being pushed to the margins. This gradual decline set the tone for what would come next. Other creatures, rising in number and variety, would take advantage of the opportunities left behind. The balance of marine life was changing, moving steadily toward ecosystems where vertebrates, corals, and new arthropods would dominate. Trilobites, once symbols of abundance, had become reminders of a past world fading into memory. While trilobites still clung to their dwindling place in the seas, another story was unfolding at the edges of shorelines. The conquest of land, which had begun quietly with the earliest plants, was about to take its next hesitant step. For countless ages, dry land had been empty, a harsh frontier of bare stone and blowing dust. But now, small arthropods, distant cousins of trilobites and sea scorpions, began to test this new world. These first pioneers were not yet insects in the way we think of them today, but they carried with them the same segmented bodies and jointed legs that would one day give rise to flies, beetles, and butterflies. The fossil record tells us that millipede-like creatures were among the earliest to take those steps onto dry land. Their bodies were long and low to the ground, armored with overlapping plates, and their many legs rippled in coordinated waves as they crawled across damp surfaces. Some of the earliest fossil tracks, preserved in ancient sediments, record the faint impressions of these tiny legs pressing into mudflats, vanishing moments in deep time that hint at the courage of small animals venturing into a vast, unfamiliar world. Why did they leave the water at all? The answer lies partly in opportunity. Plants were beginning to grow along shorelines, anchoring soil and creating patches of green. With them came decaying organic matter, a new source of food. For detritus-feeding arthropods, the land offered rich rewards if they could survive the challenges. The air held oxygen, and on a small scale, oxygen levels near patches of early plants may have been especially high. These microenvironments created oases where tiny animals could breathe more easily. With each cautious step, arthropods were learning to take advantage of these new conditions, adapting slowly to life outside the sea. The challenges were immense. In the water, gills could extract oxygen efficiently, but in dry air, those same organs would quickly collapse and fail. Early land arthropods had to rely on new ways of drawing oxygen into their bodies. Tube-like openings called spiracles and simple breathing structures allowed them to survive short journeys onto land. Their exoskeletons, which in the ocean served mainly as armor, now took on another purpose, helping to retain moisture in a world where dehydration was a constant threat. Every adaptation mattered, for the margin between life and death on bare rock was narrow. The emotional weight of those first footsteps cannot be overstated. Imagine a coastline in the Silurian, the waves rolling onto mudflats as they had for hundreds of millions of years. The tide recedes, leaving wet sand glistening under a pale sunlight, and then, for the first time in Earth's history, a living creature pushes forward on jointed legs, not swimming or floating but crawling. Its body leaves a trail of tiny impressions, a delicate line across the mud. It is a moment so small that it would pass unnoticed by the planet itself, yet it carries within it the seed of every insect, spider, and crustacean that would follow. Over time, more arthropods joined the experiment. Some ventured farther inland, hugging the damp edges of streams or shaded areas where mosses and liverworts held moisture. Each generation tested the limits of survival a little more. Fossil evidence of breathing structures and hardened cuticles suggests that natural selection was steadily refining their ability to endure air, sunlight, and dryness. The land, once silent and lifeless, now carried the faint sounds of tiny legs rustling across the soil. These first arthropods were not hunters of large prey, nor were they builders of great structures. They were small recyclers, feeding on detritus, breaking down plant matter, and beginning the first terrestrial food webs. Their work, though quiet, was essential. By decomposing organic material, they helped return nutrients to the soil, making it richer and more capable of supporting expanding plant life. In this way, animals and plants together formed the beginnings of a true ecosystem on land. The sight of one of these millipede-like crawlers against the backdrop of an empty continent would have been both strange and moving. A tiny creature dwarfed by silence, creeping across stone that had never before known the weight of an animal. Each step was a claim, however fragile, on a new world. These were the first footsteps on Earth's barren soil, the beginning of a journey that would eventually fill the land with forests, insects, and the animals that would follow. From these tentative movements, life's great migration from sea to land gained its first momentum. What began with a few cautious crawlers would, in time, become a flood of diversity. The conquest of land was no longer a dream held only by plants and fungi. Now, animals too had begun to take part, setting in motion a story that would shape every future chapter of Earth's history. As the first plants crept further inland and the earliest arthropods began to press their fragile bodies against new soil, something even larger was changing. It was not confined to a patch of moss or a line of footprints in the mud. It was the air itself. For the first time in Earth's history, the atmosphere was being reshaped not only by volcanoes and oceans, but by living things that grew from stone and stretched toward sunlight. When plants established themselves along the edges of ancient coastlines, their impact went far beyond the green shoots visible to the eye. Through photosynthesis, they began to draw in carbon dioxide and release oxygen, a quiet exchange that gradually altered the balance of the skies. Oceans had always carried photosynthetic algae, and these tiny organisms had been releasing oxygen for hundreds of millions of years. Yet, in the Silurian, photosynthesis reached the land. Here, above the tides, the air itself became the medium of transformation. Each patch of moss or vascular stem was like a small pump, breathing carbon dioxide in and oxygen out. Individually, these plants were fragile, often only a few centimeters tall, but together they began to shift the composition of the atmosphere in ways that would ripple across time. This increase in oxygen did not happen all at once. It was a gradual rise, measured in small increments over millions of years. But those small changes carried immense meaning. Higher oxygen levels made the air more breathable, not just for the first arthropods crawling on land, but eventually for every creature that would follow. It also set the stage for larger and more complex organisms to evolve in the distant future. The air that fills our lungs today carries within it the legacy of those first Silurian plants, whose simple tissues began a chain of events that still sustains life. At the same time, the roots of these early plants were reaching down into rock and sediment, creating the beginnings of soil. This new soil acted as more than just a surface for growth. It became a system for capturing and storing carbon. As plants died and decayed, carbon that might once have lingered in the air was locked away in sediments. Roots also released organic acids that broke down minerals, allowing nutrients to cycle through ecosystems for the very first time. This process helped stabilize levels of carbon dioxide, moderating the swings between extreme heat and cold that had once governed Earth's climate. The effect was subtle but profound. In earlier ages, climate had lurched between deep freezes and searing warmth, driven largely by shifts in volcanic activity and continental positions. Now, with plants regulating carbon through their growth and decay, Earth began to find a steadier rhythm. Instead of violent swings, the climate entered a calmer phase. Greenhouse gases still rose and fell, but the feedback loops of roots and soils added a new stabilizing hand to the system. It was the beginning of a balance between geology and biology, a partnership that would grow ever more important as forests expanded in later periods. Imagine the atmosphere of the Silurian sky. It was not yet the clear blue dome we know today, but it was slowly gaining the composition that would make such skies possible. The air carried more oxygen than in earlier ages, enough to support a new variety of life, yet still far below modern levels. To breathe, it would have been difficult for us, but to the first land dwellers, it was a gift. Every patch of greenery was like a beacon, enriching the air above it, and every square meter of soil was a quiet reservoir, holding carbon and moisture, preparing the world for greater abundance. These atmospheric changes also influenced the chemistry of the oceans. With more stable levels of carbon dioxide, surface waters warmed and cooled in gentler cycles. Coral reefs, already thriving, were given steadier conditions in which to grow. Nutrients carried from land into rivers and estuaries fed marine ecosystems, tying together the health of continents and seas in ways that had never existed before. The rise of plants was not only a terrestrial event, it was a planetary shift that touched every breath of air and every wave of the sea. As time moved on, the slow enrichment of oxygen and the regulation of carbon dioxide would allow more ambitious steps onto land, paving the way for larger plants, more diverse arthropods, and eventually the vertebrates that would crawl from water. But in the Silurian, these changes were still quiet, measured not in sudden leaps, but in patient accumulation. The air was learning to hold life, and life was learning to shape the air. With the atmosphere finding this new balance, the stage was set for Earth to undergo even more dramatic transformations. Deep beneath the surface, the restless movements of continents were preparing to reshape the very outline of the planet, drawing land masses together and closing ancient oceans. While plants and small animals were beginning to alter the air and soil above the surface, deep within Earth another force was at work. It was the slow, unstoppable motion of the continents, driven by heat rising from the planet's core. What seemed like still, silent ground was in fact always on the move, gliding on molten currents far below. In the Silurian, this movement was shaping the world into a new form, one that would determine where seas gathered, where mountains rose, and where life could thrive. The great Iapetus Ocean, which for millions of years had stretched between ancient continents, was beginning to close. This vast body of water, once as wide as the modern Atlantic, slowly narrowed as the continents surrounding it drifted together. Piece by piece, Laurentia, Baltica, and Avalonia crept closer, drawn by the restless motion of Earth's crust. Where they met, the seafloor was thrust downward, swallowed into the deep mantle. Above, immense pressure folded and fractured the land, raising it into ridges and ranges that had never before touched the sky. The collision of continents created mountains that stood as fresh scars on the surface of the planet. These ranges were not as high as the towering Himalayas of today, but in the Silurian landscape they were dramatic, jagged lines cutting across coastlines and plains. Their peaks were raw and sharp, not yet softened by erosion, and their slopes spilled sediments into nearby seas. Every river that carried particles of ground rock into the water helped enrich shallow basins, feeding coral reefs and nurturing new ecosystems. The birth of mountains was also the birth of fresh soils, as minerals exposed to wind and water broke down to nourish the expanding green world. The closing of the Iapetus Ocean did more than reshape the land. It altered the circulation of water across the entire planet. Oceans are not still. They are vast conveyors of heat and nutrients, driven by the positions of continents and the pull of winds. When the Iapetus narrowed and disappeared, it forced ocean currents into new paths. Warm waters that once flowed freely across its width were redirected, changing climates along distant coasts. Cold currents shifted too, bringing oxygen and nutrients to different depths. The seas of the Silurian were alive with coral, fish, and arthropods, and all of them felt the subtle hand of these new currents guiding their world. To imagine this, picture Earth from above. The continents, still smaller than the ones we know today, are like fragments drifting toward one another. Laurentia sat near the equator, its tropical warmth feeding shallow seas. Baltica and Avalonia approached it from the south, closing the gap of the Iapetus. Between them stretched a narrowing ocean, its waters funneled through tighter channels as land pressed closer. Where these fragments touched, mountains heaved upward, and the geography of the planet shifted in ways that would last for tens of millions of years. For the life that swam in Silurian waters, these changes meant new opportunities and new challenges. Coral reefs grew larger along the edges of continents, enriched by sediments and nutrients from the rising mountains. Fish and invertebrates found new habitats in these reef systems, expanding in diversity. At the same time, shifting circulation could also bring instability, stirring up coastlines and altering where oxygen reached deeper waters. Life had to adjust, just as it always had, to the slow and powerful rhythm of tectonic change. The creation of mountain ranges also set the stage for climates that were more varied across the continents. Higher elevations cooled the air, casting shadows that altered rainfall patterns and created differences between coast and interior. The winds carried moisture from seas onto slopes, where rivers began to carve valleys that would later host plants and animals. Even in the Silurian, when land was still largely barren, the foundations of these future ecosystems were being prepared by the slow grind of tectonic plates. These changes unfolded over spans of time so vast that no single creature could ever perceive them, yet their consequences were immense. Every collision of land, every mountain that rose from the sea, was part of a story that linked geology and biology together. The currents of the ocean and the shape of the continents were not separate from life. They were the stage upon which life evolved. And while the land was rising into mountains, the world of fire beneath the surface was far from silent. Volcanoes, fed by the same tectonic forces, were reshaping coasts with rivers of lava, creating landscapes where land and sea collided in even more dramatic ways. While continents collided and mountain ranges rose from the closing of the Iapetus Ocean, another force worked restlessly across the surface. Volcanoes, fed by the same deep motions of Earth's crust, marked the landscape with fire. Their eruptions poured molten rock across coasts and islands, reshaping the land in sudden bursts of heat and ash. Though violent, these events played a quiet role in preparing Earth for the spread of life, creating soils rich in minerals and landscapes where water, fire, and the first greenery could meet. Imagine standing at the edge of a Silurian shoreline. The air is heavy with warmth, the seas stretch shallow and wide, and on the horizon a volcano looms. Its slopes are streaked with hardened lava, black against the softer tones of mudflats and reefs. Without warning, fire bursts from its summit, clouds of ash rising into the sky. Streams of lava pour downward, hissing as they meet the sea. The water boils and churns, releasing plumes of steam that climb into the air. For hours or days, the eruption transforms everything nearby. Where there was once coastline, now lies fresh rock, raw and bare. At first glance, it would have seemed like devastation, yet these eruptions provided a foundation for life. Volcanic rock, though harsh and unforgiving, is rich in minerals. When it cools and weathers, it breaks down into fertile soils that can nourish plants. In the Silurian, as the first vascular stems pressed upward from the ground, volcanic landscapes offered patches where growth could take hold. Tiny plants, no more than a few centimeters tall, anchored themselves in cracks within the stone, sending roots into crevices. With each root, the rock fractured further, crumbling into particles that became the basis of soil. Lava that once destroyed became the seedbed for Earth's future forests. The meeting of lava and water created other strange and dramatic environments. As molten rock entered shallow seas, it formed new land almost instantly, solidifying in shapes that looked jagged and alien. Pillars of black basalt rose where waves once rolled. Steam clouds turned the skies hazy, mixing with ash to create temporary nights. For the creatures of the Silurian seas, from eurypterids to early fish, these eruptions brought sudden changes. Reef ecosystems could be smothered under falling ash, yet over time, the nutrients released by volcanic debris enriched waters, allowing corals and algae to grow again. The cycle of destruction and renewal was constant, a rhythm that shaped both land and sea. These volcanic regions would have been some of the most dramatic places on Earth to witness. Imagine coastlines where rivers of fire met shallow lagoons filled with coral. The bright orange glow of lava contrasted with the calm green shoots just beginning to spread across nearby rock. In one direction stood lifeless black stone, still smoking from eruption. In another, small patches of plants clung to soil, softening the edges of the landscape. Fire, water, and green life met in fragile balance, each force reshaping the other. The gases released by volcanoes also influenced the air. Carbon dioxide poured into the atmosphere with each eruption, joining the slow adjustments already made by plants and soils. While too much volcanic activity could warm the planet, over long stretches of time, the balance between eruptions and plant growth helped regulate the climate. Every burst of fire added another thread to the complex web that tied geology and biology together. The living world and the restless earth beneath it were inseparable, each shaping the other's fate. Ash carried by winds spread far beyond eruption sites, settling into oceans and across continents. These layers of ash preserved in rock today serve as time markers for geologists, thin stripes within limestone and shale that record ancient moments of fire. To the Silurian world, they were both a challenge and a gift. Plants found nutrients in the ash. Animals found new coastlines where none had existed before, and ecosystems slowly reclaimed what eruptions had taken. It is easy to picture these volcanic landscapes as places of danger, filled with fire and smoke, yet they were also places of beginnings. On fresh stone, the first greenery appeared more vivid, each small stem standing out against the dark background of lava fields. In tidal pools, carved by cooling rock, arthropods crept along damp edges. In nearby reefs, marine life flourished once sediments settled. These were places where Earth revealed its dual nature, at once destructive and creative, violent and fertile. And while volcanoes shaped the coasts with fire in the seas beyond, reefs continued to grow in size and complexity, forming underwater worlds that rivaled the grandeur of any mountain range. Beyond the coastlines, where volcanoes spilled their fire into shallow waters, another world was growing in quiet magnificence. Beneath the surface, reefs were rising, vast living structures built not of stone alone, but of countless organisms working together. They were the coral and stromatoporoid partnerships of the Silurian, a union that transformed shallow seas into underwater cities. Corals had already existed for millions of years, but in the Silurian they found powerful allies. Stromatoporoids, a group of sponge-like organisms, fused with corals to create structures that were larger and more enduring than either could have built alone. Layer upon layer of calcium carbonate was deposited as these creatures grew, solidifying into frameworks that could stand against waves and currents. Over time, these frameworks became reefs that stretched for kilometers, forming barriers, lagoons, and platforms teeming with life. Swimming above one of these Silurian reefs would have been like entering a different world. The seas were warm, clear, and shallow, bathed in sunlight that illuminated every detail of the living landscape. Between branching corals and domed stromatoporoids, countless species found a home. Fish darted through narrow channels, their armored scales glinting in the filtered light. Crinoids, sometimes called sea lilies, raised their feathery arms into the water to catch drifting food. Brachiopods, shelled creatures that anchored themselves to the reef, covered surfaces in great numbers, opening and closing their valves in gentle rhythm. The biodiversity of these reefs was astonishing for their time. Before the Silurian, reefs had been smaller and less complex. Now, they became enormous hubs of activity, comparable in ecological importance to the great coral reefs of the modern world. Every crevice offered shelter to small invertebrates. Every ledge provided a hunting ground for predators. Trilobites, though in decline globally, still scuttled across the reef floor, scavenging among the shadows. Early jawed fish patrolled the waters, while eurypterids prowled the margins, testing the edges of this bustling habitat. The reefs themselves were more than habitats, they were stabilizers of the oceans. Their massive structures broke the force of waves, creating calm lagoons where sediments could settle and life could flourish. They captured and recycled nutrients, building resilience into ecosystems that were still recovering from earlier extinctions. By expanding into shallow seas across the globe, Silurian reefs turned once empty waters into thriving communities, spreading biodiversity like green patches across a barren landscape. The scale of these reefs is difficult to imagine without comparison. In places like what is now Gotland in Sweden, the fossilized remains of Silurian reefs still stretch across the land, preserved in limestone cliffs. These ancient structures are so vast and detailed that geologists can walk through them as though exploring frozen ruins of an underwater city. Every layer of stone preserves the growth of corals and stromatoporoids, and every fossil reveals a piece of the bustling life that once thrived there. To stand before these fossil reefs is to glimpse the architecture of deep time, reminders of ecosystems that supported the earliest complex communities of fish and invertebrates. Reefs also played a role in shaping the chemistry of the oceans. By locking calcium carbonate into their skeletons, corals and stromatoporoids altered the balance of minerals in seawater, a process that influenced marine chemistry for millions of years. Their structures trapped sediments, filtered water, and created gradients of light and shade that encouraged further diversification. Reefs were not passive backdrops to life, they were engines of ecological complexity, continually creating new opportunities for organisms to adapt and expand. The visual beauty of these reefs, if we could see them, would have been breathtaking. Picture vast expanses of shallow seas, their floors covered in branching corals, domed stromatoporoids, and clusters of crinoids swaying gently with the current. Brightly armored fish swam in schools, their bodies flashing in the sunlight. Shelled brachiopods covered the reef surface like fields of blossoms. Small predators darted in and out of coral branches, while larger hunters glided silently above. Every moment was filled with motion, every surface alive with color and texture. As reefs expanded, they created new coastlines and lagoons that reshaped the geography of shallow seas. Volcanic islands became fringed with coral, their black basalt softened by living walls of white and pink. Sediments from rising mountain ranges were caught and stabilized by reef systems, protecting coastlines from erosion. In this way, reefs connected the forces of land and sea, geology and biology, into a single evolving system. And while reefs flourished beneath the surface, in open waters beyond their protection, new predators were rising, armored fish with powerful jaws that would begin to test the balance of these fragile ecosystems. As reefs grew across the shallow seas, creating vast underwater cities, another shift was beginning in the open waters. It was not a change in the corals or the invertebrates that clung to them, but in the vertebrates that swam above. For hundreds of millions of years, the seas had been ruled by creatures that either filtered tiny food from the water or hunted with claws and spines. Now, for the first time, fish with true jaws began to claim their place in the oceans. With jaws came new power, and with that power came predators that reshaped the balance of life. Among the first of these hunters were the acanthodians, sometimes called spiny fish. Their bodies were sleek and elongated, with rows of sharp spines jutting from their fins. Though many were small compared to later giants, their appearance marked a revolution. They were fast swimmers, with skeletons made of cartilage rather than bone, a lightweight structure that gave them agility in the water. In their shape and movement, they resembled the sharks that would come much later, gliding through shallow seas in sudden bursts of speed. Some fed on plankton, filtering it from the water with gill rakers, while others snapped up smaller animals with their new jaws. Even in their modest size, they demonstrated the versatility that jaws could bring. Placoderms, by contrast, were armored giants compared to the acanthodians. Their bodies were clad in thick plates of bone that encased their heads and shoulders, giving them the appearance of living tanks. Unlike the soft-bodied arthropods or the delicate shells of brachiopods, these fish carried protection that few creatures could penetrate. But the most significant feature of placoderms was not their armor, it was their jaws. Hinged and lined with sharp edges of bone, these jaws could bite with force, gripping prey in ways no earlier creature could. Where eurypterids relied on claws and spines, placoderms could seize, tear, and crush. In a world where such a skill had never existed before, this was a profound evolutionary leap. The presence of these new predators altered marine ecosystems in ways that rippled outward through every reef and lagoon. Fish that could be hunted developed new strategies of survival, swimming faster or seeking shelter among coral branches. Invertebrates that had once lived exposed on open seafloors now found themselves vulnerable, their shells no longer enough to guarantee safety. The simple food webs of earlier oceans began to shift into more complex systems of predator and prey, chase and escape. Each bite taken by a placoderm or a canthodian echoed into the evolution of countless other species, forcing them to adapt or vanish. The sight of a Silurian sea filled with these early predators would have been both mesmerizing and unsettling. Imagine standing above a clear lagoon, looking down through the water. Schools of armored placoderms patrol the shallows, their plated heads moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm, while spiny acanthodians dart past in sudden flashes of speed. Beneath them, brachiopods and corals hold steady, unaware of the hunters above. Each movement of these fish speaks of the new reality. The age of passive feeders was ending, and the age of active predation had begun. These early predators were not yet the rulers of the sea in the way that sharks would later become, but they were pioneers. They opened ecological niches that had never existed, proving that jaws could be used not only for feeding on plants or plankton, but for grasping, tearing, and dominating. In time, this innovation would give rise to sharks, bony fish, and eventually the ancestors of amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. The power of jaws would echo far beyond the Silurian, shaping every corner of Earth's future ecosystems. As placoderms and acanthodians spread, they joined the reefs and shallow seas as integral players in the expanding web of life. Their rise was not the end of the story, but a turning point. For every predator that hunted, there were smaller, stranger creatures that thrived in their shadows, weaving new roles into the fabric of marine life. While armored placoderms and spiny acanthodians were beginning to prowl the reefs and lagoons, not every life form in the Silurian seas depended on jaws and armor. Some of the most important players in this watery world were far smaller, stranger, and more delicate. They were creatures that did not inspire fear in the way giant sea scorpions did, nor did they gleam with heavy plates of bone, yet without them, the oceans would not have thrived. These quiet drifters and crawlers were the hidden engines of Silurian ecosystems. Among them were the graptolites, colonies of filter feeders that floated like thin ribbons through the open seas. To the eye, they would have seemed almost insubstantial, delicate chains of tiny cups linked together, drifting with the currents. Each cup housed a small animal, and together the colony lived as one. They fed by straining plankton from the water, capturing the microscopic life that teemed invisibly around them. Graptolites left behind fossils that look like pencil scratches pressed into shale, dark zigzagging lines that trace the outlines of their colonies. These fossils are so abundant and distinctive that geologists use them as markers to date ancient rocks, a testament to how widespread graptolites once were. For millions of years, graptolites drifted across the oceans in vast numbers, their colonies rising and falling with the tides. They were not hunters, and they built no reefs, yet they occupied a vital role at the foundation of the food chain. By capturing plankton, they made energy available to larger creatures. In their countless swarms, they were a constant source of food for early fish and other filter feeders. To picture the Silurian Sea without them is impossible, for they were as integral to those waters as sunlight itself. Alongside these floating colonies lived other small but fascinating animals. Early mollusks, ancestors of creatures we would recognize today as clams, snails, and squids, moved through reefs and shallow bays. Some clung to rocks or burrowed into sediments, filtering food from the water, while others grazed on algae that grew along the seafloor. Their shells came in many shapes: coiled spirals, ridged cones, and simple smooth ovals. Each form a solution to survival in a competitive sea. Among the most striking of these mollusks were the early nautiloid relatives, cephalopods, whose ancestors had once been the rulers of Ordovician oceans. By the Silurian, their numbers were fewer, but their presence was still unmistakable. Imagine long, straight-shelled nautiloids gliding through the water, their tentacles reaching out to grasp prey. Some were small, no longer than a hand, while others stretch several meters, their shells striped and chambered, housing the animal in its outermost section. Using jet propulsion, they could move with sudden bursts of speed, making them some of the most agile hunters in the seas. Although overshadowed by the rise of jawed fish, these nautiloids remained important predators, maintaining their role in the balance of marine life. What tied these creatures together was not size or strength, but their role in supporting ecosystems. Graptolites fed on the invisible abundance of plankton, turning sunlight into sustenance for larger animals. Mollusks recycled nutrients by grazing, filtering, and burrowing, their constant activity keeping sediments alive with motion. Nautiloids and their relatives maintained pressure on smaller prey, shaping the dynamics of food chains. They were the background players, yet without them, the reefs would have been emptier and the seas less diverse. The Silurian Ocean was not a place dominated only by giants. It was alive with multitudes of these smaller beings, each one essential to the rhythm of life. Imagine drifting beneath the surface. Armored placoderms move above, their plated heads glinting in the light, but in the water around you, ribbons of graptolites twist gently with the current, while coiled mollusks rest on the seafloor, and straight-shelled nautiloids glide in slow arcs. It is a world both strange and delicate, where the smallest creatures often carried the heaviest burden of sustaining life. These modest players set the stage for what was to come, proving that complexity does not always begin with size or strength. In the quiet work of filter feeding, grazing, and drifting, they built the invisible framework upon which larger predators relied. And as life expanded into new forms and new habitats, the record of these strange creatures would remain, etched into stone, whispering of seas that once swarmed with colonies, shells, and tentacles. Beyond these delicate drifters, the story of the Silurian is also told in the rocks themselves, where their fossils, alongside corals and stromatoporoids, preserve vivid snapshots of a world in transition. Long after the seas of the Silurian vanished, their story remained hidden in stone. The world that once swarmed with graptolites, placoderms, sea scorpions, and coral reefs did not disappear entirely. It left behind traces pressed into the fabric of the earth, records so delicate that they could easily have been lost, yet so resilient that they endured for hundreds of millions of years. These fossils are our window into a forgotten age, and they lie waiting in the layers of limestone that formed when ancient seas hardened into rock. Limestone is born from water. In shallow seas, the shells and skeletons of countless organisms settle to the bottom, mixing with sediments of sand and mud. Over time, as layers build and pressure grows, these remains compact into stone. Within these layers, the details of the Silurian world were captured. Fossils of corals, brachiopods, crinoids, and mollusks are sealed into limestone deposits, still preserving the shapes they had when they lived. The cliffs of Wenlock Edge in England and the island of Gotland in Sweden are among the most famous examples, places where you can walk across landscapes built almost entirely from Silurian seas. Every surface tells the story of life that flourished hundreds of millions of years ago. Among the most important of these fossils are stromatoporoids, the sponge-like organisms that partnered with corals to build reefs. Their layered skeletons became massive structures, and when preserved in limestone, they serve as unmistakable markers of ancient reefs. To a paleontologist, a stromatoporoid fossil is more than just a stone. It is evidence of a bustling ecosystem. Where they are found, one can imagine a reef filled with darting fish, anchored brachiopods, and colonies of graptolites floating nearby. The fossils map out the outlines of ancient cities beneath the sea, showing us where reefs once stood and how they spread across the Silurian world. These fossils are not only beautiful to look at, with their intricate patterns and detailed shapes, they are also essential tools for science. By studying the sequence of rock layers, paleontologists can piece together the timeline of Earth's history. Silurian strata reveal not just what creatures lived, but when they appeared and how ecosystems changed after the great extinction that ended the Ordovician. Fossils of jawed fish, for example, show the first steps toward the rise of predators that would dominate later ages. Graptolite impressions in shale record the vast swarms that once filled the oceans, each line marking a moment in deep time. Together, these records allow scientists to reconstruct a living picture of a vanished age. Walking through a Silurian limestone quarry, one might see layers stacked one upon another, each representing thousands of years. In one layer, a crinoid stem curls like a fossilized flower stalk. In another, the branching form of a coral colony spreads across the stone. The deeper you go, the farther back in time you travel, peeling away the history of the seas that once covered the continents. These fossils are not scattered at random, they are organized, each layer recording a chapter in the story of life. Silurian rocks are also important for understanding how Earth itself has changed. The chemistry locked within limestone tells us about the composition of the oceans, the levels of oxygen in the air, and the fluctuations of climate. Traces of volcanic ash within these rocks show when eruptions shook the seas, while layers of sediment reveal shifts in sea level. Fossils combined with chemistry allow scientists to see both the biology and the geology of the Silurian interwoven into one story. It is striking to realize how fragile these records are. Many fossils are small, no larger than a fingertip, yet they carry the weight of entire worlds. A single brachiopod shell can tell us the depth of the water it lived in, the nutrients it fed on, and the stability of its ecosystem. A stromatoporoid structure can reveal the location of a reef that once stretched for kilometers. Even the faint scratches of a graptolite colony pressed into shale can help define the boundaries of geological time itself. These treasures of stone do not only exist in faraway cliffs and islands, they are scattered across much of the earth, because during the Silurian, shallow seas covered large areas of the continents. Wherever those seas once lay, their fossils may still be hidden. Quarries, cliffs, and riverbeds around the world hold fragments of the Silurian, pieces of a puzzle that scientists continue to assemble. From fossils and rocks, the Silurian comes alive again. The limestone preserves not just the shells of ancient creatures, but the rhythm of ecosystems, the rise of predators, and the quiet work of reefs. These records lead us forward into the next chapter of how plants and animals reshape the world around them, turning bare stone into thriving landscapes. The rocks of the Silurian hold the fossilized remains of ancient seas, but on land, something more subtle was beginning, something that would eventually change the surface of Earth forever. Small plants, no taller than a hand, were spreading across damp soils and rocky ground. They had no flowers, no leaves as we know them today, only simple stems and branching tips. Yet, in their quiet persistence, they were performing acts of engineering that reshaped the world. These fragile pioneers were the first true ecosystem builders on land. When a plant pressed its roots into the ground, it did more than hold itself upright. It broke apart rock, grain by grain, slowly creating soil. Where bare stone had once baked under sunlight, thin layers of earth began to form, darkened by organic matter. In these patches, water lingered longer after rainfall, and nutrients recycled more efficiently. Each new shoot contributed to this transformation, making the surface less barren and more hospitable. What appeared to be the smallest of steps was in truth the laying of foundations for future forests. Shade was another quiet gift. A cluster of stems, though simple, cast shadows across the soil beneath. In those shaded spaces, the ground held more moisture and stayed cooler than the exposed rock around it. That difference, though slight, created tiny habitats. Small arthropods that had just begun to test life on land could find refuge in these damp pockets, where the air held more humidity and the soil was softer underfoot. By merely standing upright and reaching towards sunlight, the first plants were already shaping the environments of other creatures. As these patches of greenery grew, so did the complexity of the land. Decaying stems and fallen spores added organic matter to the soil. Each cycle of growth and death enriched the ground, building layers that could support more plants. With those layers came the beginnings of terrestrial nutrient cycles. Elements like nitrogen and phosphorus, once locked in stone or swept away into the seas, were now moving through living tissues on land. When plants decayed, these nutrients returned to the soil, ready to be used again by the next generation of shoots. It was the start of a cycle that continues to this day, one that sustains every forest, meadow, and field. The first greenery also changed the way water moved across the continents. Bare rock could not hold rain for long, but roots anchored soil, slowing erosion and allowing water to seep into the ground. Streams ran clearer, carrying fewer sediments into the seas. This gentle control of water by plants reshaped coastlines and floodplains, creating conditions where life could spread more easily. Even the smallest stems had an influence far larger than their size suggested, softening the harshness of the continents and beginning the long transformation from rock to rich landscapes. The emotional power of this shift lies in its quietness. Imagine a Silurian hillside, once nothing but stone and dust. Now, a thin patch of green spreads across its surface, tiny plants clinging to cracks in the rock. They cast faint shadows, they trap moisture, and they create pockets of life. Insects and arthropods creep among them, taking advantage of what shelter they provide. Spores drift on the breeze, settling in new places where they begin the cycle again. The land, once silent, now carries the first whispers of ecosystems. Though these plants were small, their impact reached forward into the distant future. By creating soil, they laid the groundwork for forests that would rise hundreds of millions of years later. By cycling nutrients, they ensured that larger and more complex plants could take hold. By offering shade and shelter, they invited animals to explore further from the water. These were the first steps in a chain of changes that would eventually cover Earth in vast forests, home to countless species. The story of the Silurian is often told through its oceans and reefs, but here on land, the quiet labor of plants was every bit as revolutionary. They were not simply living on the continents, they were reshaping them, preparing the ground for what was to come. And as they worked, they were not alone. Hidden beneath their roots, another partnership was beginning to form, one that would amplify their power and ensure that life on land could spread even further. As the first plants pressed their roots into cracks and began to green the continents, they did not do this work alone. Hidden in the soil around their stems, invisible to the eye, another form of life was shaping the future of the land. These were fungi, ancient organisms that had been part of Earth's ecosystems long before plants took their first steps onto shore. In the Silurian, plants and fungi began to form partnerships that would transform both groups and forever alter the surface of the planet. Fungi had a special gift. They were masters of breaking things down. Their thread-like filaments, called hyphae, could penetrate stone and soil, releasing acids that dissolved minerals locked within. What for plants was an immovable barrier, fungi could unravel piece by piece. As they spread through the soil, these microscopic threads created networks that released nutrients such as phosphorus and nitrogen, making them available for other organisms. Where bare rock would have starved a plant of essential resources, fungi turned it into a storehouse of food. Plants, in turn, provided something fungi could not make for themselves: sugars. Through photosynthesis, plants captured sunlight and carbon dioxide, turning them into energy-rich compounds. By linking their roots with fungal filaments, they traded some of this sugar in exchange for the minerals the fungi gathered. This exchange was not simply beneficial, it was essential. Without it, the first vascular plants would have struggled to survive on land, for their tissues alone could not reach deeply enough into stone to gather what they needed. This was the birth of mycorrhizal relationships, the symbiosis that still binds plants and fungi together today. Mycorrhizae are the bridges that connect roots to soil, allowing nutrients to flow in both directions. In the Silurian, they were the hidden scaffolding beneath every patch of greenery. Even the tiny Cooksonia, with its simple stems and spores, likely relied on fungal partners to draw nutrients from the thin soils around it. This invisible alliance turned fragile plants into ecosystem engineers, giving them the strength to spread further across the continents. Imagine a patch of Silurian shoreline, where green shoots no taller than a hand rise from the damp ground. Beneath the surface, an entire unseen world is alive with activity. Fungal threads stretch outward like an underground web, winding around grains of sand and particles of rock. They dissolve minerals, transport nutrients, and deliver them to the plant roots they embrace. In return, sugar flows back into the fungi, fueling their growth and extending their reach. Above ground, the plants stand quietly in the sunlight, but beneath, the soil hums with an exchange as intricate as any marketplace. These partnerships also accelerated the weathering of rock, speeding up the formation of soil. As fungi dissolved minerals, they helped create the fine particles that made the ground fertile. Each new layer of soil captured more water, held more nutrients, and supported more plant life. This feedback loop, once begun, grew stronger with every generation. Plants provided energy, fungi provided minerals, and together they made the land more habitable. It was a cycle that would eventually give rise to forests, but in the Silurian it was only beginning, whispered into existence by tiny organisms working in unison. Fossil evidence suggests that some of the earliest plant-fungal associations were already in place by the Silurian, and perhaps even earlier. Microscopic fossils show traces of fungal filaments inside ancient plant tissues, evidence of symbiosis nearly as old as land plants themselves. To find these connections frozen in stone is to glimpse the very moment when two kingdoms of life first linked their fates. The importance of this partnership cannot be overstated. Alone, plants might have clung to the margins of coasts, limited by poor soils and harsh conditions. Alone, fungi would have remained recyclers, breaking down matter without the energy to build complex ecosystems. Together, they created the foundation for terrestrial life. They were not simply neighbors, they were collaborators, partners in a grand experiment that would carry life from the water's edge into the heart of the continents. As these microbial partnerships spread, they wove a hidden fabric beneath the land. Every step taken by an arthropod across the soil, every spore drifting on the wind, was made possible by this silent alliance. It was the unseen world beneath the ground that gave rise to the visible world above it, the delicate threads of fungi supporting the fragile shoots of plants. And as this alliance deepened, it prepared the land for even greater transformations, where coastlines and tidal flats would become the next frontier for expanding life. At the boundary where land met sea, a new world was taking shape. The tidal flats and shorelines of the Silurian were unlike anything we know today. These were wide, open expanses where the sea advanced and retreated in long, slow breaths, leaving behind mud that shimmered beneath the sunlight. Here, life gathered at the edges, clinging to both water and land, testing the limits of what was possible. Muddy coastlines were some of the busiest places in the Silurian. With every tide, sediments carried by rivers and waves were spread across the shallows, forming sticky flats and pools. These environments were rich with nutrients, stirred constantly by the rhythm of the water. Small arthropods, among the first to venture from the safety of the sea, scurried across the damp surfaces. Their tracks, pressed into soft mud, were fragile at the moment of their making, yet some survived long enough to be preserved in stone, leaving us faint records of the earliest animal steps on land. Millipede-like creatures with many tiny legs crawled among decaying plant matter, while smaller invertebrates wriggled in the shallow pools, thriving in the microhabitats that tides created. It was here, too, that plants played a vital role. Without roots, the tides would have swept soil away, stripping coasts back to bare rock. But the earliest vascular plants, anchored firmly into the ground, held the soil together. Their stems, simple and leafless though they were, created resistance against the water's pull. In places where green patches grew, mud was not so easily washed away. Instead, it accumulated, thickened, and built up new layers for more life to settle. Each tide left something behind, and each plant rooted those sediments in place, slowly transforming coastlines into environments that could sustain more complexity. The imagery of these tidal flats is striking. Imagine standing at the edge of a Silurian sea, the horizon glowing under a warm sunlight. As the water retreats, it leaves behind a landscape of glistening mud, patterned with ripples and dotted with shallow pools. Among them, small green shoots rise in clusters, their fragile stems trembling in the breeze. Between these shoots, tiny arthropods creep, their segmented bodies leaving trails in the wet ground. The scene is quiet, yet alive with subtle motion, the first delicate attempts of life to master the space between sea and land. These coastal zones were also nurseries of resilience. Organisms that survived here learned to endure cycles of flooding and exposure, saltwater and fresh rainfall, wetness and dryness. For plants, it meant evolving stronger tissues that could resist drying under the sunlight. For arthropods, it meant finding ways to breathe in open air, even if only for short periods of time. The tidal flats forced life to adapt quickly, offering both opportunity and danger. Those that succeeded in this harsh environment paved the way for more ambitious colonization of the continents in the ages to come. What made these habitats especially important was the sheer variety of microenvironments they contained. Pools of standing water sheltered larvae and small invertebrates. Channels carved by tides created shifting landscapes of silt and sand. Patches of anchored plants stabilized one area while leaving another exposed. The result was a patchwork of habitats, each one offering a different chance for survival. Even in their simplicity, tidal flats and shorelines encouraged diversity, acting as gateways between the abundance of the sea and the emptiness of the land. The emotional weight of this moment in Earth's history lies in its fragility. Life was still clinging to the edges, hesitant to step too far inland, Every footprint in the mud was temporary. Every spore carried on the wind was uncertain. Yet together they marked a quiet determination. The green shoots and creeping arthropods on Silurian shorelines were small, but they were opening doors to futures far larger than themselves. As these coastlines stabilized and expanded, they gave rise to calmer seas and clearer waters, where reefs could flourish in even greater abundance. The world was moving steadily toward balance, each new contribution of land and sea building upon the last. The Silurian world was one of water. Warmth filled the atmosphere, and the seas swelled higher than in many ages before. Continents, still small and scattered compared to those of today, were partly drowned beneath shallow oceans that stretched inland for great distances. Vast portions of land were submerged under warm, sunlit waters, creating broad continental shelves where reefs and tidal ecosystems could thrive. High sea levels were the natural outcome of a greenhouse like climate. Glaciers that had once gripped the earth during the violent end of the Ordovician were gone, melted into the oceans, raising them across the globe. With ice largely absent from the poles, the seas filled every low basin, pressing against the edges of continents. The planet was wrapped in warmth, and this warmth gave the Silurian its distinctive character. Unlike the ages before it, the Silurian did not swing wildly between extremes of heat and ice. Instead, it was a rare calm interval, a pause in Earth's restless rhythm. The climate was steady, stable enough that ecosystems could expand without constant collapse. Corals built reefs that lasted for millions of years. Plants spread further inland without the sudden threat of global freezes. Animals tested life at the water's edge in an environment that gave them time to adapt. It was not a world without challenges, but compared to the tumult of earlier ages, it was unusually gentle. This stability can be imagined as a long, shallow breath in the history of the planet. For countless ages before, Earth had lurched between catastrophe and recovery. The Ordovician had ended in one of the deadliest extinctions, driven by ice and sudden warming. Before that, in the Cambrian, life had exploded in a frenzy of innovation, filling the seas with new forms as quickly as many of them disappeared. The Silurian, in contrast, was slower and more measured. It was a time when balance held, allowing fragile experiments to succeed. The high seas of the Silurian created habitats that were both vast and rich. Warm, shallow waters stretched over continental shelves, bathed in sunlight that penetrated deep into the water. These environments were ideal for reef-building organisms, for filter feeders, and for early fish that patrolled the open waters. With the seas stable, ecosystems grew more interconnected, weaving stronger chains of life. Diversity increased, not in sudden bursts, but in steady layers, like sediments quietly settling on the seafloor. For animals living at the time, this calm climate meant opportunity. Predators could specialize in their hunting strategies, while prey species developed defenses at a pace that matched the challenges they faced. Plants expanded inland in slow but persistent waves, undisturbed by catastrophic climate swings. Arthropods could crawl further from shore, knowing that the conditions would not change overnight. In this way, stability fostered innovation, not through chaos but through patience. The imagery of the Silurian seas is one of expansiveness. Imagine looking out over an ocean that glitters beneath a steady sunlight, its surface calm and warm. Instead of towering ice sheets at the poles, waves roll unhindered from one horizon to the next. The land is reduced to islands and narrow continents, fringed with reefs and lagoons. Shallow seas stretch across regions that today are far inland, their waters filled with corals, fish, and drifting colonies of graptolites. The earth breathes softly, and in that softness life finds room to grow. This rare calm did not mean stillness. The planet's crust continued to move, volcanoes still erupted, and species still faced the pressures of survival. Yet the background rhythm was steady. The stage set not for extinction but for expansion. The Silurian stands out in deep time because of this balance. It was not an age defined by disaster or revolution, but by the quiet consolidation of progress already begun. It was a bridge, linking the violent upheavals of earlier ages with the dramatic expansions that would come in the Devonian. From the stability of the climate and the generosity of the seas, life gained strength. Ecosystems grew more intricate, food chains lengthened, and the first whispers of forests deepened their roots in soil. In this calm world, the groundwork was laid for transformations that would reach far beyond the Silurian. And as balance held, plants themselves were changing, developing new features that allowed them to rise taller, spread wider, and shape the landscapes in even more profound ways. In the quiet calm of the Silurian world, plants began to attempt something extraordinary. Until this point, the pioneers that had crept onto land were simple, low to the ground, and fragile against the elements. They lay close to the damp soils, tethered to moisture, and unable to stretch very far. But within their tiny bodies, new innovations were forming, innovations that would completely reshape Earth's landscapes. The first great step was the development of vascular tissue. This was a delicate system of internal channels, almost like thin threads, that allowed water and nutrients to be carried upward through the plant. Before vascular tissue, a plant could only stay alive where it touched wet ground, its cells absorbing moisture directly from the surface. This kept them small, hugging the soil. With vascular tissue, plants gained the ability to move water from roots to stems and nutrients from the soil to leaves. It was like building a hidden plumbing system inside their fragile green bodies, opening a pathway to new heights. As these channels evolved, plants no longer had to sprawl flat across the earth. They could lift themselves up, pushing tiny stems into the air, reaching towards sunlight. Even a few centimeters of extra height meant a difference in survival. Light was more easily captured, spores could be carried further by the wind, and competition for space began in a new way. The earth, once quiet and bare, now held the beginnings of structure. Small upright stalks dotted the edges of waterlogged ground, fragile but determined. One of the most important early forms was Cooksonia, a plant so small it could be held between two fingers, yet so significant it marks one of the greatest leaps in history. Its stems were little more than green tubes, only a few centimeters high, ending in tiny capsules that released spores, but those tubes contained the vascular tissue that made all larger plants possible. In Cooksonia, the story of towering forests and endless grasslands had its first chapter. Its presence in the Silurian landscape was like the opening sketch of a masterpiece that would take millions of years to complete. With vascular tissue came another change, the ability to branch. Instead of a single stalk rising into the air, plants began to divide their stems, sending out forks and splits. This may seem simple, but it multiplied their possibilities. Branching allowed plants to spread more spores, to reach into different angles of sunlight, and to create a broader structure that could resist winds. Each division was like a choice, an experiment in form. Some branches grew upward, some outward, and the patterns would eventually give rise to the complex architecture of trees. In the Silurian, however, it was only the beginning, a delicate testing of new designs. Imagine a shoreline dotted with these first branching plants, their thin stalks swaying with the breeze. They were not yet forests, not even meadows, but the hint of them was there. Where once there had only been flat mosses or simple liverwort-like plants, now small upright forms began to catch the eye. They rose above the ground just enough to cast faint shadows, the very first shade to fall upon the continents. The impact of these innovations spread far beyond the plants themselves. By lifting higher, they exposed more of their surfaces to the air, which increased the exchange of gases. Photosynthesis, already transforming the atmosphere, accelerated. Oxygen seeped more steadily into the skies, and carbon dioxide was drawn down into the tissues of stems and roots. With vascular systems, plants could extend their reach further inland, no longer confined to the edges of waterlogged flats. Soil began to form where roots burrowed, and the rhythm of nutrient cycles deepened. The Silurian world was still sparse, its continents quiet and lonely, but these small stems represented an unfolding promise. They were fragile, yet persistent, and with each generation, they tested new solutions. Taller growth, stronger tissues, branching patterns, more efficient transport systems, each change slowly building the foundation for what would later become towering forests. From here, the story of plants would continue to expand, and with it, new possibilities for life. Animals that crawled from the seas would find shelter in their shade. The soils they built would anchor ecosystems. The air they altered would make breathing easier for creatures still waiting to appear. But in these early moments, the revolution was measured in centimeters, in the quiet rise of green stems against barren rock. And as these first vascular plants reached higher into the Silurian sunlight, the stage was being set for food chains more intricate and balanced than ever before. Life has always been bound by the quiet rules of energy. To exist, every creature must draw power from somewhere, whether from the sun's light, from the minerals locked in stone, or from the bodies of other living things. In the Silurian world, this balance of energy began to take on new depth, weaving together the earliest complex food chains that would support entire ecosystems. At the very base of this new structure were the producers, organisms capable of capturing sunlight and transforming it into food. In the oceans, algae bloomed in endless variety. Tiny single-celled forms floated near the surface, their green bodies shimmering in sunlight. Larger types grew in mats along the seafloor, creating carpets of life in shallow bays. Each of these algae pulled carbon dioxide from the water and released oxygen in return, a trade that slowly shifted the chemistry of both air and sea. On land, the very first plants joined this role as producers. They were small and fragile, no taller than a hand, but they carried out the same quiet work. By anchoring themselves into shallow soils and raising tiny green stems to the light, they expanded the reach of photosynthesis onto the continents. For the first time, sunlight falling on dry ground could be stored in living tissue. These modest plants joined algae in forming the base of a food web that would stretch upward into animals, predators, and eventually the giants of later ages. Consumers emerged to take advantage of this new wealth of energy. In the seas, arthropods of every shape filled the niches of grazers, scavengers, and hunters. Trilobites still crept along the bottoms, their segmented bodies searching for food in the sediment, while newly evolved eurypterids patrolled shallow waters with claws and paddles, asserting themselves as rulers of their realms. Smaller arthropods sifted through algae and detritus, linking the base of the food web to higher levels. Fish, too, had entered the scene. Jawless varieties swam in schools, filtering particles or scraping algae from surfaces. Above them, placoderms and acanthodians, armored and spiny, introduced predation of a new kind. With jaws came the ability to bite, to grasp, to shred. For the first time in Earth's history, Fish hunted fish, layering complexity into the food chains of the sea. Prey and predator became locked in a cycle of adaptation, each shaping the other as evolution tested countless forms. On land, the consumers were fewer but no less significant. The earliest arthropods, likely millipede like creatures, fed on decaying plant matter and microbial mats, recycling nutrients back into the soil. These small foragers were among the first animals to take advantage of the energy stored in terrestrial plants. Though tiny, their role was immense. They connected the new green producers of land to the greater cycles of life, ensuring that energy could move through soil, plants, and animals in patterns that would one day support forests and entire ecosystems. With producers anchoring the base and consumers linking each level above, the Silurian world began to stabilize in ways it had not before. Energy flowed in cycles, from sunlight to plant, from plant to grazer, from grazer to predator, and then back again through decay. Microbes broke down the remains of plants and animals, returning nutrients to soil and water, where they could be used again by algae and roots. This recycling of matter and energy tied the system together, creating resilience where there had once been fragility. The establishment of these food chains gave the Silurian seas and lands a sense of structure, almost like invisible architecture holding life in place. Each creature, no matter how small, played a part in keeping the cycle turning. Algae sustained tiny grazers, which in turn nourished fish, which fed larger predators, and all were eventually broken down to fuel the cycle anew. On land, the first plants, insects, and microbes were weaving a similar, though smaller pattern. These quiet exchanges of energy may seem simple, but they marked a turning point. In earlier ages, ecosystems were often disrupted by extremes, by sudden shifts in climate or chemistry. In the Silurian, the weaving together of producers, consumers, and decomposers created a more stable rhythm. The seas no longer belonged only to scattered survivors of extinction. They thrived with diversity, tied together in networks of energy and interaction. This stability would carry forward into later ages, laying the foundation for explosions of life to come. For now, in the Silurian, it was enough that algae sparkled in the sunlit waters, that small plants stretched on land, and that arthropods and fish danced through a web of survival more intricate than any that had existed before. Out of these delicate beginnings, the blueprint of modern ecosystems was being written, one strand of energy at a time. The Silurian may seem like an age lost to deep time, yet its story is still written in stone, preserved in delicate fossils that survived hundreds of millions of years. These remnants are windows, not only into the forms of long extinct creatures, but into the landscapes they shaped and the seas they inhabited. Some of the most remarkable of these windows lie in places that today look calm and ordinary, yet beneath the surface of their cliffs and quarries lies an ancient record of life from a world before trees. One such place is Wenlock Edge, a long limestone ridge that cuts across the English countryside. On the surface, it is quiet, covered in greenery and farmland, but hidden within its rocks is a frozen reef from nearly 420 million years ago. Here, entire communities are preserved, corals locked in growth positions, stromatoporoids layered like old masonry, and shells of brachiopods still clinging to the places where they once lived. The fossils reveal reefs teeming with life, standing tall in warm Silurian seas before forests had ever appeared on land. Walking along the ridge today is like strolling through the ruins of an ancient underwater city, its streets built of limestone, its inhabitants immortalized in stone. Further north, across the waters of the Baltic Sea, lies the island of Gotland in Sweden. Its cliffs are world famous for the Silurian fossils embedded within them, and for good reason. The island is built from ancient reef systems, their structure still visible in the exposed rock faces. Corals bloom in fossil form across the stone, like petrified gardens. Nautiloid shells coil across the layers, their elegant spirals still clear despite the ages. In certain spots, one can even trace the delicate outlines of graptolites, small colonial creatures that floated freely in the oceans, their tiny forms leaving ghostly impressions in the shale. Gotland holds one of the richest records of Silurian life anywhere on Earth, and through it, scientists can reconstruct not just the creatures, but the ecosystems that sustain them. The beauty of these fossils lies not only in their shapes, but in what they represent. The corals, delicate yet resilient, show how reef building surged after the devastation of the Ordovician extinction, covering the seas with new life. The shells of brachiopods and mollusks tell of seabeds busy with grazers and filter feeders, creatures that recycled nutrients and sustained the food web. Even the armored plates of early fish can sometimes be found, hinting at the dawn of new predators. In every limestone slab lies a record of survival, recovery, and growth. What makes the Silurian fossil record especially haunting is what it lacks. Among the corals and shells, there are no traces of trees, no imprints of ferns, no evidence of towering plants. The land was still bare. The fossils speak of a world where all the richness was in the seas, while the continents stood silent and empty. It is a reminder that the balance of Earth was once very different, that the green landscapes we know today were still only whispers on the horizon. Through these fossils, scientists can also piece together the rhythms of the Silurian climate and sea levels. Layers of limestone and shale alternate, marking cycles of rising and falling seas, of reefs flourishing and then being drowned by deeper waters. Within the patterns of coral growth and extinction, paleontologists trace the long breathing of the planet, the subtle changes that shaped where life could thrive. Wenlock Edge and Gotland are not just collections of ancient shells, they are records of Earth's pulse, its slow heartbeat across deep time. The fossils also offer a sense of scale. To hold a fragment of stromatoporoid coral in hand is to touch something that grew when land was still barren and silent. To see a trilobite fossil embedded in limestone is to glimpse an animal that scuttled along seafloors long before vertebrates walked on land. Each fossil is both fragile and enduring, a small survivor carrying the memory of an entire age. In this way, Silurian fossils remind us of how profoundly the world has changed. The reefs they preserve are older than trees, older than forests, older than grass. They belong to a chapter of Earth's history when oceans ruled the planet and life was still hesitating at the edges of land. And yet, through these remnants, we can still see the beauty, the resilience, and the complexity of a world that came before. The oceans of the Silurian were both familiar and strange. If you could step into them, the water would feel much the same, salty and full of life, yet the scenes around you would reveal a world very different from today's seas. These oceans were warm, shallow in many places, and lit by sunlight that reached easily to the seabed. They were seas of promise, but also of fragility, holding the beginnings of ecosystems that were still finding their balance. The reefs of the Silurian stood as the beating hearts of these oceans, built not only by corals, but also by stromatoporoids, sponges with stony skeletons that layered themselves into great mounds. These reefs rose into structures taller than houses, sprawling across vast areas. They were different from the reefs we know today, which are mostly formed by stony corals alone. Silurian reefs were more experimental, patchworks of creatures building side by side, weaving their skeletons into strong fortresses. Within their cracks and hollows, fish, mollusks, and arthropods found shelter, while filter feeders clustered to strain food from the passing currents. These reefs were bustling oases, yet they carried an air of delicacy. They grew in stable conditions, but were vulnerable to even small changes in the environment, relying on balance that could easily tip. Modern coral reefs, by comparison, are more specialized and complex, built by countless generations of corals working in tight partnerships with the algae inside their tissues. Today's reefs host vibrant colors and an enormous variety of life, from shoals of tropical fish to sea turtles and sharks. The reefs of the Silurian were quieter and less crowded, yet they were just as vital, for they were the first large underwater cities, the prototypes upon which future ecosystems would be built. What strikes the imagination most about the Silurian seas is not what was there, but what was missing. In today's oceans, large vertebrates dominate the scene. Whales sing across entire basins, schools of tuna move like silver storms, and sharks patrol with effortless power. In the Silurian, there were no whales, no dolphins, no sea turtles. Even sharks were only just beginning to appear in their most primitive forms. The largest predators were not fish at all, but arthropods, the great sea scorpions whose clawed arms and paddle-like limbs made them formidable rulers of the shallows. Placoderms, the armored-jawed fish, were among the first vertebrate hunters, but they were still small compared to the giants that would follow in later ages. This absence of large vertebrates gave the Silurian seas a different rhythm. Predation was present, yet on a smaller scale. Ecosystems relied more on invertebrates, with trilobites, mollusks, and brachiopods filling roles that would later be taken over by more advanced fish and marine reptiles. Energy moved through food chains in a simpler way, with algae and plankton at the base, filter feeders above them, and arthropods and small fish as the main predators. Without the heavy presence of large animals, these food webs were fragile, more easily disrupted by changes in climate or sea level. The fragility of Silurian ecosystems is clear in the fossil record. Reefs grew during times of stability, but they collapsed when seas deepened or when conditions shifted. Recovery could take millions of years, and during those times, life in the oceans thinned out, becoming sparse until balance returned. It was a time when the resilience we take for granted today had not yet been fully built. The webs of life were intricate, but not yet strong, as if the seas themselves were still practicing for the complexities that would come later. Still, there was beauty in this simplicity. To drift through a Silurian reef would be to float among spiny corals and branching stromatoporoids, to watch small armored fish glint in the light, and to see colonies of graptolites drifting like lacework in the water. The seas shimmered with potential, every species an experiment, every ecosystem a fragile sketch of what oceans could one day become. As the Silurian gave way to later ages, the oceans would only grow louder, faster, and more crowded. But here, in this time, the seas carried a gentler rhythm, marked by smaller creatures, delicate partnerships, and ecosystems that were as breakable as they were beautiful. And while they may seem alien compared to the oceans we know, these Silurian seas laid the foundations for all that followed. The continents of the Silurian stretched out in long, low shapes, their surfaces quiet under the warmth of sunlight. Much of the land was bare, the rock worn smooth by wind and weather, broken here and there by shallow valleys filled with silt from rivers that trickled down from new mountains. Against this vastness, the first touches of green appeared, but they were so small and scattered that from a distance they might have gone unnoticed. Tiny patches of moss clung to damp cracks in the stone. Liverwort-like plants spread across sheltered corners of tidal flats. Cooksonia, one of the earliest vascular plants, stood no higher than a finger, lifting its simple stalk toward the sky. Together they formed little islands of life, like green freckles on the surface of an otherwise lifeless continent. If we could walk across this landscape, the silence would feel heavy. There would be no rustle of leaves overhead, no bird calls, no buzz of insects. The air would be still, broken only by the sound of wind moving over open rock or the splash of waves where the sea lapped against the land. These were not yet the continents we know, alive with forests, rivers, and animals. They were places of waiting, as though the land itself was holding its breath for the life that was only beginning to arrive. In some spots, the soil was just starting to form. Roots reached into cracks, splitting stone into powder, mixing it with organic material from decaying plants. In these thin pockets of earth, the green patches grew a little denser, holding on more firmly against the wind. Yet most of the land remained raw and exposed, too dry and harsh for anything more than the smallest shoots to survive. The contrast between the ocean and the land was striking. Offshore, reefs built by corals and stromatoporoids were bustling, alive with fish, arthropods, and mollusks. On land, in comparison, the world was almost entirely empty. To our eyes, used to landscapes filled with color and movement, the Silurian continents would have seemed profoundly lonely. Imagine standing on a broad plain of bare rock, with only a few dark green clumps scattered here and there, each no bigger than a rug. The horizon would stretch unbroken, without the canopy of trees or the shelter of shrubs. There were no forests to soften the land, no grass to ripple in the wind, no flowers to paint the ground with color. The silence would press in from all sides, broken only by the whisper of air across stone. Yet within this stillness was possibility. Each green patch was a foothold, a promise of what was to come. The mosses and tiny vascular plants were not impressive in size, but their presence was revolutionary. They were beginning the long work of transforming the continents from barren wastelands into environments capable of supporting larger, more complex life. By anchoring soil and releasing oxygen, they laid down the first threads of a tapestry that would eventually cover the land in forests. It is hard not to imagine what these early landscapes would one day become. The same rocks that bore only scattered moss in the Silurian would, millions of years later, support towering trees and dense ecosystems filled with insects, amphibians, and reptiles. The contrast could not be sharper. What was once silent and empty would one day resound with the calls of animals, the hum of insects, and the roar of rivers cutting through thick vegetation. But here, in the Silurian, all of that was still in the future. The land was sparse, waiting for life to take hold more firmly. The first whispers of green had appeared, but they had not yet grown into the chorus that would come in the Devonian, when true forests would spread across the continents. For now, the Earth's landscapes were quiet, almost lonely, but beneath that quiet surface, the foundations for everything that followed were already being set. The Silurian stretches across more than 20 million years of Earth's history, yet when compared to the explosive moments that came before and after, it feels almost quiet. The Cambrian had dazzled with sudden bursts of new life, creatures with strange bodies and unfamiliar forms, appearing as if out of nowhere, filling the oceans with endless experiments in survival. Later, the Devonian would roar with energy as fish diversified into powerful predators, forests spread across the continents, and the first vertebrates pulled themselves onto land. The Silurian sits between them, not empty, but slower, steadier, like a pause in Earth's rhythm, where life gathered strength before its next leap. This age often feels like a waiting room, a span of time where changes were happening, but on a subtler scale. Plants had begun to appear on land, but they were small and sparse, covering only patches of rock and soil. Animals had not yet joined them in great numbers, so the continents remained largely silent. In the oceans, reefs grew, fish developed jaws, and arthropods thrived, yet even these steps seemed more like gentle progress than dramatic transformation. It was an age of preparation, a steady laying of foundations that would allow later revolutions to unfold. To imagine the Silurian is to see the contrast between Earth's great moments of upheaval. In the Cambrian, diversity exploded in a geological instant, filling seas with trilobites, early mollusks, and the first vertebrates. Life had raced forward, experimenting with eyes, shells, and skeletons. In the Devonian, change accelerated again, as vast forests rose to dominate the land and fish transformed into amphibians that would one day give rise to reptiles, birds, and mammals. By comparison, the Silurian seemed slower, as though life was catching its breath after the devastation of the Ordovician extinction and quietly building the pieces that would power the next surge forward. The oceans reveal this pace most clearly. Reefs grew larger and more complex than ever before, yet the animals within them were small compared to later giants. Placoderms, the armored-jawed fish, were a new and important presence, but they had not yet reached the great sizes they would in the Devonian. Trilobites, once dominant, were dwindling, while arthropods like sea scorpions prowled the shallows. It was a time of steady diversification, of species adjusting to new roles, of ecosystems expanding but not yet reaching the explosive abundance that was just around the corner. On land, the feeling of patience was even more striking. Plants had begun to alter the face of the continents, but they were still low to the ground, fragile, and scattered. They had not yet built the deep soils that would support towering trees. Insects and other arthropods had made their first cautious steps ashore, but vertebrates were still confined to the water. The silence of these landscapes, broken only by the whisper of wind over bare rock and the faint rustle of mosses, reflected the unhurried pace of this era. It was as if the land was being carefully prepared, the canvas primed for the forests and animals that would soon transform it. The Silurian reminds us that evolution does not always move in dramatic bursts. Sometimes it proceeds in quiet steps, each one small, yet together reshaping the world. The rise of vascular plants, the appearance of jaws, the growth of reefs, and the slow stabilization of the climate were not spectacular in themselves, but they laid the groundwork for all that followed. Without these steady advances, the revolutions of the Devonian could never have occurred. In this way, the Silurian was a bridge. Behind it lay chaos, a world devastated by mass extinction and reshaped by the sudden rise of complex life. Ahead of it waited abundance, an earth crowded with forests, rivers alive with fish, and land ready to welcome the first four-legged pioneers. The Silurian carried the planet across this gulf, steadying the balance, strengthening the systems, and patiently setting the stage for what was to come. And as the continents waited in silence, and the oceans thrived with quiet progress, the story of life moved forward, step by step, toward the next great transformation. The Silurian may seem like a quiet chapter when compared to the explosive changes of the Cambrian or the Devonian, yet its legacy is permanent and profound. It was in this age that the Earth began its journey toward becoming the green world we know today. The first plants may have been small and fragile, but their presence marked a turning point that could never be undone. Once life had taken root on land, the continents would never again return to silence. The greening of the continents began with scattered patches of mosses, liverwort like plants, and simple vascular shoots. They clung to damp cracks in the rocks, spread across muddy shorelines, and slowly crept inland as they adapted to drier conditions. What began as thin carpets of green soon became the foundation of an ecological revolution. By capturing sunlight and drawing carbon dioxide from the air, these plants began to alter the very chemistry of the atmosphere. They were small in size, but their impact stretched across the entire planet. One of the most enduring gifts of the Silurian was the creation of soil. Before plants, the continents were covered in bare rock and dust, surfaces that could not support complex life. When roots grew into stone, they pried it apart, grinding it into smaller pieces. As plants died and decayed, their remains mixed with this mineral dust, creating the first thin soils. Over time, these soils deepened, becoming rich with nutrients that could support larger and more complex plants. In this way, the Silurian laid down the groundwork for the forests that would rise in later ages. Without this first step, the land could never have supported the ecosystems that followed. The development of soil also reshaped the flow of water across the continents. Bare rock allowed rain to rush away quickly, carving valleys and washing nutrients into the sea. Soil held the water for longer, slowing erosion and creating more stable environments. Streams and rivers began to cut gentler paths, and pockets of wetlands appeared where plants and microorganisms thrived together. These changes were small at first, but over millions of years they transformed the face of the continents, giving rise to landscapes that could support forests, animals, and entire food webs. At the same time, plants expanded the cycles of oxygen that sustain life even now. Through photosynthesis, they released oxygen into the atmosphere in greater amounts than ever before. Algae in the oceans had already been producing oxygen for hundreds of millions of years, but the addition of plants on land tipped the balance, raising oxygen levels slowly but steadily. This change did more than refresh the air. It allowed for larger and more active animals to evolve. Every breath taken by creatures today, including us, carries with it the legacy of those first plants that drew in carbon and gave out oxygen under the Silurian sunlight. This age also began the long relationship between plants and climate stability. By absorbing carbon dioxide, plants helped regulate the greenhouse effect, balancing the warmth of the Earth's surface. This early regulation was not perfect, but it set in motion a process that has continued ever since. The link between plants, soils, and climate was forged in these quiet millions of years, a connection that still governs the health of the planet. The Silurians' legacy is everywhere we look. Every tree that shades a forest floor, every blade of grass in a meadow, every garden soil that crumbles between our fingers owes its existence to the first plants that took hold on bare rock. The oxygen that fills our lungs, the cycles of nutrients that feed animals and people alike, the stability that allows complex life to flourish, all trace back to the fragile green pioneers of this forgotten age. From a distance, the Silurian may appear to have been slow, a time of small steps rather than dramatic leaps. Yet it was in this quiet pace that permanence was built. The greening of the continents, the creation of soil, and the expansion of oxygen were not fleeting experiments. They were permanent transformations that reshaped the earth forever, laying the foundations for all that would follow. And as the Silurian came to a close, the stage was set for a louder, more crowded world. The Devonian would soon see forests rising high, rivers filled with fish, and the first vertebrates pulling themselves onto land. But behind it all, the quiet revolution of the Silurian remained, steady and enduring, the silent architect of the green earth we call home. When we look back to the Silurian, it is easy to see it as a distant and alien chapter of Earth's story, a time of small plants and quiet seas, of creatures that no longer roam the world. Yet its lessons are still with us. What unfolded then continues to echo in the balance of the planet today. The first plants that spread across the land did more than simply turn rock into soil or release oxygen into the air. They began to stabilize Earth's climate, creating the long feedback loops that regulate temperature and atmosphere. By drawing carbon dioxide from the air and locking it into the ground, they softened the intensity of greenhouse conditions. This quiet process, repeated countless times in countless tiny shoots, shifted the balance of the planet toward stability. It reminds us that even small changes, multiplied across vast spans of time, can alter the fate of the entire world. Modern science shows us just how important that early lesson was. Plants remain one of the greatest regulators of the atmosphere. Forests, grasslands, and wetlands absorb carbon, breathe out oxygen, and influence rainfall and temperature. When plants thrive, they cool and balance the planet. When they disappear, as through deforestation or climate disruption, balance falters. The Silurian teaches us that the greening of Earth was not a one-time event, but an ongoing responsibility. The cycles begun then still depend on living systems to keep them steady. The oceans of the Silurian offer another lesson. Reefs built by corals and stromatoporoids became hubs of resilience, binding together ecosystems and creating safe spaces for diversity to flourish. Even when surrounding environments shifted, reefs provided a measure of stability, giving life the chance to recover and adapt. Today, reefs still serve this role, though they are built by different architects. Coral reefs harbor a quarter of marine life, creating nurseries for fish, buffering shorelines against waves, and maintaining the health of entire seas. The Silurian reefs remind us that such structures are not just beautiful, but essential. Without them, oceans lose both stability and richness. There is also something humbling in how slowly the Silurian unfolded. The first plants were no taller than a finger, the first arthropods on land left only faint trails in mud, and the first fish with jaws were small compared to what would follow. Yet these tiny steps reshape the earth in ways more permanent than any sudden explosion of life. It is a reminder that change does not always arrive with drama or violence. Sometimes it is quiet, patient, and steady, yet no less powerful. Our own world, facing rapid change today, can learn from this truth. Even the smallest adjustments, whether in ecosystems or in human choices, can ripple outward across centuries. The Silurian also shows how resilience is built layer by layer. Plants anchored soil, fungi deepened the cycle of nutrients, reefs gathered diversity into networks of survival, and oxygen slowly filled the air. Each step by itself seemed small, but together they created the conditions for forests, animals, and eventually humans. In our own age, resilience may depend on similar layering, on protecting ecosystems, restoring balance, and allowing small steps to accumulate into something greater. The forgotten world of the Silurian carries with it a message that feels timeless. Earth has always found ways to heal and stabilize itself, often through the quiet work of its smallest inhabitants. The greening of continents, the building of reefs, and the first steady cycles of oxygen and carbon all began not with giants, but with delicate pioneers. They remind us that the foundations of life are fragile, and that safeguarding them is essential to the planet's balance. And so, the lessons of the Silurian are not locked in stone. They live on in the forests that cool our atmosphere, in the reefs that shelter our seas, and in the knowledge that even the tiniest steps forward can alter the course of Earth's story. From mosses softening rock to trees shaping climates, from reefs anchoring ecosystems to humans facing choices today, the thread remains unbroken, reminding us that the quiet revolutions are often the ones that matter most. The Silurian is not a chapter that often makes its way into memory. It lacks the thunder of the dinosaurs, the drama of great extinctions, or the spectacle of towering mammoths. And yet, without it, there would be no forests, no animals on land, no humans to wonder at the story of life. It was here, in this quiet age of shallow seas and fragile green shoots, that Earth first began to change from a barren world into the living planet we know today. The continents that had once been silent began to whisper with life as mosses crept across stone and the first vascular plants reached for the light. Roots broke apart rock, creating the first soils. Spores rode the wind, carrying the promise of green farther than ever before. In the oceans, reefs expanded into vast underwater cities, sheltering fish and invertebrates, stabilizing ecosystems in ways that still echo in our seas. And in those same waters, jaws emerged for the first time, rewriting the rules of survival and setting the stage for predators that would one day dominate the world. All of these changes seemed small in their time, no more than quiet steps forward. But together they transformed the planet, shifting the balance of atmosphere, building the foundation of soil, and preparing Earth for forests that would one day stretch from horizon to horizon. The Silurian was not loud, but it was permanent. It was not dramatic, but it was decisive. It gave us the green earth. When we walk through a forest today, hear birdsong at dawn, or breathe in the air that sustains us, we are experiencing the legacy of that forgotten age. The Silurian lives on in every leaf and blade of grass, in every patch of soil and drop of oxygen. It is the hidden architect of the living world, quietly shaping the conditions that made our existence possible, and it invites reflection. How many other chapters lie buried beneath our feet, written in stone and fossil, waiting to be remembered? The Earth story is not only about the great and the dramatic, it is also about the overlooked, the quiet revolutions that unfolded slowly but reshaped everything that followed. The Silurian reminds us that even the most modest beginnings can hold the power to transform the world. As we close this journey, I would love to know which part of this forgotten age spoke to you most. Was it the fragile courage of the first plants taking root on barren rock, or the alien seas ruled by scorpion-like giants, or perhaps the vast reefs that built the first underwater cities? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let us keep uncovering the mysteries of our planet together. If you have enjoyed this gentle journey through time, do consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Each new subscription helps this little corner of the internet grow, making it possible to continue exploring Earth's deepest and most hidden memories. A warm thank you to those of you who are already part of this community. Your support keeps these long, quiet stories alive. Tonight, as the Silurian drifts back into the past, remember that our world is built upon forgotten ages like this one. Without them, there would be no green earth, no forests to shelter life, no animals to walk the land, no humans to dream of the stars. Now, let us carry this story with us as we close our eyes and wonder what other forgotten chapters still lie hidden, waiting to be uncovered.